Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I have a story to tell. The story starts in 2013. I was 14 at the time and I needed some money. I lived in a pretty bland, tight-knit suburb, and I ended up working as a babysitter for this elderly woman who still had a few very young kids. The kids I babysat were an 8-year-old boy named Luke and a 7-year-old girl named Patty. They were good kids and didn't cause much trouble, and it made my job real easy. At least for a while. In May, some weird things started happening. Patty was getting violent. Repeatedly I'd catch her hitting Luke, pulling him around by his hair because he had quite long hair, and she'd also cuss me out and hit my knees whenever I'd scold her or anything. When her mother would show up, however, she'd completely drop the act. I'm not a kid's psychologist, but I figured at the time she was, well, a psycho. Probably bipolar or something. But it was November that year that things started to unravel, like yarn going through a meat grinder. I showed up to babysit the kids, and I noticed immediately that Patty wasn't in the living room waiting for me. Luke seemed more quiet than usual. He was always a gentle giant of a kid, never spoke much, and had a slight lisp that got him bullied, but he'd brighten up when I was around. I asked him where Patty was, and he mumbled a little and nodded his head towards the stairs. When I got close to him, I noticed this streak across the side of his face. It looked a whole lot like ash, although very faint. It looked very deliberate, like someone had used their thumb to make this marking. When I looked towards the stairs, I felt my heart sink. The stairs always kind of freaked me out, because the way they were built, they were always dark. No matter what. They were meant to have a light bulb, but it was too high up for the old woman who lived there to ever change, so she just left it to be pitch black. But I saw at the top of those stairs, in the darkness, 2 little white dots. They quickly zipped away as I stepped up onto the stairs, and just immediately I felt some primal fight or flight instinct kick in. I darted backwards and quickly grabbed the landline. I punched in the old woman's number, but messed it up in my haste, and I had to redo it, and I remember that distinctly because when I messed it up, something answered. I only heard a split second of it, but it was a low, but soft, raspy, groaning sigh. I couldn't get to the old woman, however, because the landlines had been cut. At this point, I don't know what's going on, but I'm shitting myself. I grab Luke gently by the wrist and I tell him we're going to go for a little walk. He follows, and as I'm stepping out the door, I just hear thudding rapidly behind me, really loudly. I somehow didn't break into a sprint there, and I think that might have just saved my ass. When I turned around, something about the house looked wrong. It took me a second to realize it. The windows had all been blacked out. I couldn't see inside, but it was the middle of the day. The rational part of my brain finally kicked in, and I brought Luke to the neighbor's house. I explained to them, or rather lied, that there might be some kind of home intruder and that Patty was missing. She called 911, and while Luke was sitting with me in her living room, he stuttered out something and got really panicky, like a spell that was put on him had just been broken.
Some man came and took Patty.
I felt my stomach sink, and I asked what he looked like. Luke started softly sobbing as he just said "I don't know" over and over, and that's when something in my brain clicked. While I'd been babysitting the 2 kids, I noticed over and over this one weird guy would pass by the house every day, very slowly, and it was when he was around that Patty would have her worst outbursts. This could have all been very irrational, but Luke told me the one thing he remembered, and I nearly shat myself.
He gave her a balloon.
The man who had always passed the home always carried with him a red balloon. It was the entire reason I thought he was so weird. I can't offer any real exciting end to this story. Patty went missing, and this guy was never found. I ran into Luke recently. He was, I think, 15 at the time, and I was probably just in my 20s, but he was a wreck. He looked 3 times his age, and had bags under his eyes the size of parachutes. I wish him the best, honestly.
This occurred in 2010. I went to Bangor, Maine to visit my brother. Around 2 a.m., I left his house and walked to a longtime friend who also lived in the city. It is only about a 10-minute walk. While walking, the next thing I can remember was having my eyes closed and hearing this calm, relaxing, soothing, almost hypnotizing female voice saying,
Kevin, it's okay, we're here to help. It's okay, we're not going to harm you. It's okay. We're going to make you feel better.
Then my eyes opened up and, at first, there was a blinding light. But then it went away. I could see the room and there were 2 gray aliens. They were very tall. The room was 2 different colors. One color on the top of the wall and one at the bottom. The top color was purple and the bottom color was blue. I asked the alien if they were going to harm me and what they were going to do to me. They replied back that they were going to help and fix me. My mouth wasn't moving when talking to them. The next thing I remember was that each gray was on each side of me. They then put me up against a cold metal thing and it was moving with each of them. It took me into a hall to the left of the white room. The hall was dark, cloudy or misty like fog. The hallway must have been 40 or 50 feet long. Before I reached the next room, I could see a huddled circle formation of at least 7 to 8 tall grays in the room to the right. There was an exit to another room next to them. The walls of the room were indented almost like a V-shape indent. When entering the room, I could smell a chemical-like smell, something like a mix of bleach and ammonia. They took me into the center of the room. I remember that one of them was so tall he had to bend a little to look me in the eyes. At this point, I wasn't really scared. It seemed hard for me to see their faces at times. I was still standing up against that thing they put me against in the white room. One of them put their hand on my nose and another one put a small black tube up my nose. It made a noise. The alien grays had long fingers, were very tall and had a little mouth that moved in an up and down motion, similar to a fish mouth, but nothing was coming out. I remember screaming after they did that. All that time, I could hear the voice saying,
It's going to be okay. We're here to help.
This was in a soft, calm voice, as if they were trying to relax me. But I was now scared. The next thing I remember was that I was now lying down. They then brought me towards the left side of the room. I began to get hostile and remember cocking my left leg back and kicking the alien to my lower left. He slammed against the wall and fell down. The other grays quickly backed off. From then on, I remember I was on the side of the road again. I realized what had happened, though I was shaken and confused. I was also tired, with a lost feeling. A police officer drove slowly next to me and I asked him where a particular street was. He looked at me for a few seconds. He didn't say a word, just pointed and stared with this nasty look. I later realized that I had lost 3 or 4 hours of time. It was nearly 6 a.m. when I reached my friend's house. I know that there are other encounters, but this one sticks out in my head the most.
I am an engineer and I'm an eyewitness to a Bigfoot sighting here in Colorado, along the Platte River. This was about 30 years ago, so it was 1984 on Thanksgiving and a friend of mine was with me. So he also saw it. We had an extended look at what appeared to be to us like a 7-foot guy in a gorilla suit that was intentionally stamping the ground and breaking limbs as if to scare away predators or something. We had a perfect view. We were sitting on a ridge looking over a pond at a row of trees that was along a ditch on Slaughterhouse Gulch. We saw a Sasquatch or something, you know. We were trying to convince each other that it was a guy in a gorilla suit, but that didn't work and we were scared to death. So we sat there petrified as this thing broke through the trees and stomped on the ground and walked along this bank. It was a good 200 meters or more that we were in eyesight contact, right? And we both just sat there and stared. There had been a whole wave of Bigfoot sightings that year. In fact, a girl got kidnapped on Cherry Creek, which is one of the tributaries of the Platte River, and she swore that it was Bigfoot that had abducted her and carried her over his shoulder. There was another older girl, a teenage girl, who told a similar story. And when we went to investigate the next day we found footprints, but they were in the snow. The same thing at the Cherry Creek sighting. We went there the next day and we found footprints, but they were in the sand. It had snowed and the snow was melting and the footprints were disappearing as we saw them, but they appeared to be about 14 to 16 inches. There was another sighting that was accompanied by UFO sightings, which was at another tributary of the Platte River, which is now Chatfield Reservoir, and there were deaths involved in that one. Then there was another sighting within a few days of that at a trailer park in Woolhust, the previous Woolhust Country Club, which is also along the Platte River. This girl claimed that she was out for a walk. Something was rustling through the bushes and whatever it was grabbed her and threw her over its shoulder, and she showed us the jacket she was wearing and it was covered in this really stinky weird hair. It was not like fur. It was more like hair, but it wasn't really like hair. They were thick, thicker than a human hair. This was almost 30 years ago now. I plucked a couple of the hairs off of the jacket, which smelled really bad. It smelled like wet bull or whatever. We were pretty interested at the time because there was a missing girl and we went to go on a search party and they found her just as we got there. The search and rescue team had found her and she was fine.
Before I proceed with my story, I would like to clear some things up. First, I am not a good storyteller, and second, I'm not even good in English, so please, bear with me. So here's my story. This story was shared by our previous nanny, Jen. She was only 19. She's already 20 now. This story is about her sister. Let's call her May. May was said to be abducted by some elemental entities near their place. Jen is originally from Samar. Here in the Philippines, Samar is known for elemental entities living in this place such as witches, shamans, and some things like that. Her family is still living there except for her older brother who already has a wife and a family living here in Manila. According to Jen, May was beautiful, or should I say gorgeous. Though they are all tan in complexion, May was the only white, and she even looked like the Santo Nino with curly brownish hair. Gorgeous as Jen described her. Jen was only about 11 years old when she and the rest of her siblings were playing hide and seek outside their house in some places behind the trees. When night fell, she and all of her siblings went back to their house except for May. Their mother got worried, and thinking that May was still hiding behind the trees, Jen, together with some of her siblings, went out to look for her since she was also very worried about her younger sister. Hours passed, but May was nowhere to be found. Their mother started to call out for their neighbors and asked for help in looking for her young daughter. She was eventually found by a neighbor. Her foot was stuck inside a huge tree. Huge tree in the forest. According to her, she was invited by a lady into the tree. Her mother got worried even more. Midnight came and the whole family were sound asleep when they heard May cry. Their mother switched on the light and cried with what she saw. May's back was elevated from their bed while the rest of her body was still lying. May vomited and even turned to violet. Their mother called a witch doctor and started a ritual. The witch doctor said that an elemental entity in the tree was really fond of her and she wanted May to come with her. The witch doctor could do nothing but some rituals to save May. About 3 or 4 in the morning, May died. She wasn't able to hold on because of the pain. During her wake, their grandmother was staring at the huge tree with tears falling from her eyes. She then suddenly said,
You were wrong.
They were all puzzled.
You shouldn't have embalmed her body. She was still alive and was only out of her body. The lady took her for a while and May would have returned to her body.
They all cried with what they heard. When the grandmother was asked how she knew that, she said that May was behind the huge tree, smiling with the tears falling from her eyes.
This took place on the night of April 15, 2013, and it has bothered my family and I since. We live in Portland, Oregon. That night, my mother had a very bad respiratory illness. She woke in what she described was like a drug-induced stupor. She saw blurry images of what appeared to be people in full surgical dress. One of the doctors called her by name, told her everything would be fine. She recalls a needle being inserted in her arm and blood was taken. She was unable to speak and was very confused before she passed out. The next morning she woke up. She saw a needle mark in her arm and became very upset. My stepfather, who was also in the bed with her, noticed that he also had one, which scared him. My stepfather has a serious phobia of needles. When he sees the doctor, he must be sedated before they can insert any sort of needle into him. He literally throws up and passes out on seeing needles. He often must leave the room when blood is taken from my mother. He remembered nothing, but was feeling very drowsy and confused. They both came in and asked me if I had let paramedics in the night before. I was wary of their question and told them no. That night, I was surfing the internet. Since I was working a graveyard shift at the time, I had only woken up at about 8 p.m. Yet after 2 hours of being awake, I suddenly was overcome with such drowsiness and exhaustion I crawled back into my bed and slept on. I fell asleep within minutes, which was very strange. I woke up feeling sore all over, which was weird, but no puncture or needle marks on my arms at all. I had no recollection of anything the night before. When they both showed me these strange needle marks, I was intrigued. They told me that they had fallen asleep suddenly, probably around the same time I did, judging by what was on TV when they fell asleep. What was even more bizarre is that my cats were very spooked the next day. This was very interesting, as my largest cat never gets spooked. Vacuum cleaners, dogs, loud sounds. Nothing phases him. Yet, I found him hiding under a bunch of boxes, and he hissed at me each time I tried to reach in and get him. The other cats were terrified and hiding all through the house. My stepfather also told me the door was unlocked. I remember him locking the door every night. We lived in a bad neighborhood and always made sure it was locked. We have been puzzled over it for the past 9 years, and I've done a lot of research. I cannot seem to find any possible explanations. Although I have always been interested in the UFO phenomenon, it seemed that the alien abduction theory was not a serious question.
In 2005, my husband, who I'll refer to as Bill, and I purchased a house near Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Bill was stationed there, and we figured that he would most likely stay since he was a wounded veteran from Operation Iraqi Freedom and had accepted a permanent position at headquarters. The house was built in the 1890s and had a Victorian style to it, though there had been several renovations and additions. We have 3 children, all girls, who were aged 9, 11, and 15 at the time we bought the house. There was a lot of space for everybody, including a large yard with woodland surrounding the property. When Bill returned from rehab after suffering his injuries, he didn't elaborate on how he sustained his injuries, nor did he talk about his time in Iraq. We had been married for 12 years before he was deployed, and I was content to the life as an Army spouse. When he returned, things hadn't really changed until we had settled into the new home. One morning I woke and noticed that Bill was not in bed. It was around 6:30 and he usually slept in until 7:15, then he would get up, eat breakfast, and head to headquarters. I woke the girls for school and made my way downstairs to the kitchen to start making breakfast. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed Bill was seated at the table, arms down his side and staring straight ahead. It actually shocked me because I had never seen him like this. I sat across the table and looked directly at him. After a minute or so, he looked into my eyes and said,
"I need to tell you something."
He decided to stay home that day while I proceeded to feed my girls and get them off to school. Bill continued to sit at the table the entire time, not saying a word. I could tell that the girls were a bit confused since he did not speak to them. When I returned home from dropping the girls off at school, Bill was sitting in the living room drinking a cup of coffee and reading the newspaper. I sat down on the sofa fearing that I was about to hear bad news. He looked at me and said,
"I think I'm going to be leaving soon."
I was in shock. "What exactly are you telling me?" I asked. He looked away for a second, then looked back towards me.
"It has something to do with what happened in Mosul."
His division was deployed to northern Iraq near the city of Mosul. His hands and lips started to quiver.
"Something happened that I can't explain. I wasn't able to report it to the commander because of the ramifications."
He stood up and walked over to the sofa and sat down beside me.
"The wounds I sustained were not from enemy ordnance. I was abducted by a group of people or something."
He explained that his platoon was on night patrol east of the city when a firefight began. Several of the soldiers went down, requiring a retreat in order to get the wounded out of harm's way. At one point, Bill was alone covering several soldiers who helped others back towards the city. Things had quieted down and Bill was about to head back towards base when suddenly he was knocked off his feet by a tremendously loud thud. The next thing he remembered, he was lying face up on a table in a spacious room with bright yellow lights all around. There were 4 beings that looked human but were dressed in thick dark wool-like robes. Each had a small circular cap on their heads that reflected the yellow light. One of the beings told Bill that he was to become one of them and that he had no choice in the matter. After that, he had no further memory with the beings. When he became conscious, he was in a medical helicopter on his way to Baghdad. He was told he was being transported for medical treatment at another location. He was then given what he thought was a sedative. He woke up sometime later in a dark room, unable to move. After a time, a nurse came into the room and told him that he was in Germany and being treated for his wounds. She injected something into the IV, then left, and again the room went dark. Bill thought from that time forward he was kept in a semi-conscious state for a long period of time, possibly for several weeks. About a month after sustaining his injuries, he was admitted to a hospital for rehab. This was the first time that he was able to see the extent of his injuries as well as an explanation of what he was facing. Both of Bill's legs had deep, long scars on the front and back. He was told that he lost a considerable amount of nerve and muscle tissue, but that he would be able to recover much of his strength and sensation through rehabilitation. He inquired about surgery records but was told no surgery was performed. He then asked how the wounds were closed. The physician said that there was no description of sutures or skin grafting in the record. The physician agreed with Bill that this seemed very irregular. For over a year, Bill tried to get answers but was stonewalled by military and medical officials. When he returned home, I was surprised Bill was able to move around as well as he did, even though the scars on his legs indicated significant trauma. As Bill sat beside me, his voice started to shake.
"They will come back for me. I have no way of avoiding it."
I was still awestruck by everything I had heard. "Is there any way the medical staff at the fort can help you?" He looked away and said,
"It's beyond that point."
We continued to live a fairly normal life despite what Bill had told me. He never mentioned the incident again and I tried to forget it. As time went by, I assumed Bill had suffered some form of battlefield stress disorder, though he maintained a busy and productive schedule at home and at work. One warm evening in July 2007, Bill left us. He had been working in the yard when all of a sudden my youngest girl let out a horrific scream. I ran out the back door into the yard and witnessed Bill's lifeless body laying near the poplar tree. He had taken a pocket knife and drawn it across his throat. It was so abrupt and unexpected. Bill had stated that he did not want a military funeral and wanted to be cremated. After a coroner's inquiry, it was determined that Bill had taken his own life. Last year, I was cleaning out Bill's clothes and personal effects when I discovered an envelope in a foot locker that he kept in the garage. I pulled it out and read the single sheet of paper. It read,
They told me it was time to leave. I'm sorry, though I'm sure you'll understand.
"No, I don't understand."
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.